Hi, everybody. I'm Erica Lukes, and you are here with Expanding Frontiers. You can check us out at expandingfrontiersresearch.org. Make sure that you click like and subscribe this video, share it with your friends, and if you want to support our research, please go to our website, become a Patreon member. For just $15 a month, you can help us do records requests and all the sorts of things that we are doing and are going to continue to do. We appreciate your support. You can also make a one-time donation. So if you are feeling in the generous spirits right before Halloween, that would be lovely. We appreciate all that you do for us. And I'm all very, very excited this afternoon to be here with somebody who's been on my show before, James Carrion. Everybody knows James. And if you don't, then you're going to, because James has a very diverse and interesting background. So he is an independent researcher. He's had a keen interest in the Cold War and in intelligence, which is one reason I think that Jack and I really gravitate towards his work. He holds an MA in International Studies and a BA in Russian language. And also he works in and James, you're in the cybersecurity world, right?
I am.
That is so cool. I was watching a couple of your presentations last night. And so that to me is really fascinating. And I think those are areas that I'm with the internet and the way things are happening in our world. It's nice to become more familiar with at least protecting yourself online, and that's got to
Sure.
be fun.
Absolutely.
So thank you. So what have you been up to?
Well, first, thank you for having me back on the show. It's always a pleasure to visit with you and Jack. What have I been up to? I've been up to so many things lately. My God, it never seems like there's enough time in the day. Probably the most recent thing I've done, and this is why I reached out to Jack recently, is I just wrote a 40-page paper. The title of the paper is Flying Saucers, an Opening Salvo of the Cold War. And basically what I'm delving into there is looking back at a very specific time in history, which is the summer saucer of 1947, where I'm looking at from, where Kenneth Arnold had his sighting on June 24th, all the way through when the whole Roswell press release and detraction, and then even onward towards like the Maury Island incident later in August. But specifically at that slice of time, because I have this hypothesis, which I've always wanted to put some meat on the bones of that hypothesis, which is essentially that I think my belief, or no, not just my belief, my research shows that it seems like the flying saucer story, specifically the flying saucer stories, may have been purposely planted in the US media for a very specific purpose, and that is to assist American code breakers in breaking the Soviet diplomatic code. So if for those folks who know a little bit about World War II history, you know that the Germans had the Enigma code, and the British were able to break that. And they were able to create a machine that was able to break the Enigma code and pretty regularly, which really turned the tide of the war in their favor. So I think that the Americans had a similar program, but they were specifically targeting the Soviet diplomatic code during a very perilous time, which was right after the war ended in 1945. And when we believe the Russians were really on the march towards world's dominance, because where we were afraid that Stalin, who was our friend and our ally during the war, was going to turn around and look to probably overrun all of Europe and to extend his dominance. And so we needed to stop that. And I think we pulled out a lot of the same tools and techniques and tricks of the trade that we learned from World War II, which has to do with strategic deception and also code breaking, which was a huge part of it. And so I think that we sort of, way back, even late 1946, we were already in a Cold War, in a very active Cold War.
Thank you, James. For those unaware, I'll also mention that when James was in the U.S. Army from 1983 to 1989, he was a Russian linguist and intelligence analyst. So he has some qualified opinions on this material in addition to his credentials and the degrees that he earned. I'm rather familiar with James's books and a number of his blog posts over the years that gave me an opportunity for it to kind of, for me to digest it over time. And there's some milestones in his research that I think are significant, that I want to give you plenty of opportunity, James, to tell us what you think is most important. But I'd also like to hit on some aspects of it. For instance, from my point of view, reading your work, it seemed that some points important to understand was the fascinating couple, the German couple, that was working on a weapons delivery system, how that may play in with the Kenneth Arnold sighting and the stories that seem to be put in the press about disc-shaped craft. And then how that evolves to why they would be using what came to be known as UFOs for what you refer to and the intelligence community refers to as gardening techniques. Could you discuss that and how your research progressed through that, please?
Sure. So let's start off with a couple that you mentioned. We're talking about a German scientist named Eugene Sanger and his wife, who was a mathematician, Irene Brecht. And what they were known for is, well, specifically Eugene, is he basically hypothesized what would be an intercontinental bomber. And not even a traditional bomber, a hypersonic bomber, one that would take off, hit the stratosphere, and sort of skip across the stratosphere over large distances of the Earth, and then drop a bomb where what the Germans hope would be New York City. And not only just any bomb, but actually a bomb that was clad with radioactive material, so it would be a dirty bomb. So he envisioned this during the war. He wrote a white paper on it. And what happened is, after the war, as we were looking, when I mean we, the Americans, were starting to go through and look for all of the significant German advances in technology, they found his paper. And so, of course, they marked it top secret and took it back to the States. Well, it turned out that a copy of the same paper ended up in Moscow, was translated into Russian, given to Stalin. And Stalin was just enthralled by this. He absolutely wanted to create the same type of bomber for the Soviets. And so in April of 1947, this is why the time frame is very significant, he called all of his top aeronautical engineers, and there was a gentleman who later defected to the British who informed them of this conference that was held in April 47. And basically Stalin said, I'm tasking you with creating this intercontinental bomber, this hypersonic weapon. Now, if we look at what happened soon after that, in June of 1947, just a couple of weeks before Kenneth Arnold had his sighting, so before the term flying saucer was even out there in the lexicon, there was a story that was released in the international media that surrounded this alleged new super weapon that the Americans had. And so there was a lot of speculation in the press about what it could be. And it turned out that the journalists were hypothesizing or speculating it could be an aerial weapon, because the scientists that they were after and getting quotes from, who were real scientists, there was an American and there was a New Zealander. It turns out they did real top secret work during the war. And at least the New Zealander was an expert in aerodynamics. So the speculation was, well, if it's a top secret new weapon, something allegedly bigger than the atomic bomb, and an aerial weapon at that, it must be aerial because he's the expert in aerodynamics. So that was a speculation that was bantered around in the press. Now, that story, when I first saw it, I think that's really started me on my research journey. So this was like circa, let's say 2007, 2008. I was still the director of MUFON at the time. And I thought, I have got to dig into this story. So what I found out is that the American scientist, Professor James Snodgrass, was a professor at the Scripps Institute of Oceanography in San Diego. So I flew out there in early 2009. And what I found out by going through the papers that he donated before he died to the Scripps Institute is that that particular weapon that was allegedly he was working on was a real weapon. And the report on that weapon was declassified and was available there at the Scripps Institute. And as I read through the declassified report, that's when I saw the first hint of deception, the first hint that there was something happening at a very large scale in terms of strategic deception between the US and the Russians. Because, you know, just to put it basically in the simplest terms, the real top secret scientists, a real top secret project, but it was mischaracterized in the press as some sort of aerial weapon, when in fact it was nothing to do with something that flies. It was actually a project that was trying to create an artificial tsunami. But I think probably the biggest thing that tells me deception was at play there was the fact that that project, called Project SEAL, was actually killed off in 1945. But in 1947, June of 1947, just 2 weeks before Kenneth had his famous sightings, what happened? It was misrepresented in the press as an active project, as something that the Americans were still working on. And the original folks that worked on it were agreeing with that. So they were basically playing to the press that yes, it was still an active project. So here we have just plain proof that there's some kind of deception operation going on, that was misrepresented. Now, I find it highly interesting that it was speculated to be an aerial weapon, and then just 2 weeks later, we have flying saucers hitting the news. So I think there's definitely a tie-in between those, and that this was a very specific strategic deception that was going on, where Americans were trying to convince Stalin, hey, that thing you really want, we already have it.
Yeah, I'd like to emphasize that too. Project SEAL is indeed a significant part of James's work. And whatever the reasons were that it was misrepresented, James has conclusively demonstrated that Project SEAL was a top secret weapons research and development program that existed and had been closed in 1945, yet the press was told it was active and they were influenced to believe it had something to do with an airborne weapon, potentially more powerful than the atomic bomb in 1947. So that indeed is significant and fascinating.
And there was actually another unique aspect of that, Jack, where in the press, the American scientists basically told the journalists, hey, the reason you guys know nothing about this is because it was conducted in complete secrecy outside of the US, in New Zealand. So outside of the reaches of Soviet espionage. They specifically say outside of the reaches of espionage. So that's when I started thinking, why are they pointing out that spies here in the US did not have access to that? It almost sounds like they're trying to influence or basically say, there's a reason why you know nothing about this, Stalin, is because we were doing this research way somewhere else across the globe.
So let's kind of recap where we're at. We have a German couple that is that American intelligence officials that are operating Operation Paperclip, and Russian officials that want German scientists would be interested in getting them and their work. Then this Project SEAL is misrepresented to the press, and as in 1947, and as researchers like James and Kurt Collins and many others have shown, Kenneth Arnold kind of just got to be the most famous sighting that was known. There were a number of accounts in the press of disc shapes, discs that were found, discs that crashed, things like that, along with Roswell and Kenneth Arnold. And I'm correct, James, that these were not necessarily presented as alien spacecraft, just something weird flying in the air. Is that correct?
Absolutely. Yeah, there was no connection between flying saucers and extraterrestrials or life forms from Mars or from Venus, until the journalists, the press, picked up that sort of whole explanation. But before that, it was just assumed by the average American, these must be our weapons. They must be our top secret weapons that we're developing. And an interesting aspect of that is that if we were truly going to be developing advanced aerial technology back in 1947, where would we experiment with that? Well, we would experiment it where we have vast areas of land that folks do not live on, right? In the western side of the US, which is exactly where flying saucers first made their appearance, right? And so we see this sort of track between basically Washington State all the way down to Texas. You take a straight line through that, you're going through Roswell. And basically that's where these things were flying around initially, before it expanded to all the other states. But by that time, the whole story had gone viral. So of course, these are headlines all over the US. So people started saying, oh, maybe I'll see a flying saucer today. And that's why it continued to propagate. But, I really think we need to focus in on specifically, why would the US have been doing this, right? So a lot of times when I talk to intelligence historians or even to lay people where they say, well, why would the US even do that? Was it just like a psychological operation, like we were trying to, get the Russians to be upset? No, this was, I believe, a strategic deception. And whenever you're doing strategic deception, there's always a specific reason for doing it, where you want your enemy, in this case, the Russians, to either act or not act. So it could be that maybe the inaction was, don't dare march across Europe because we have these things that can go out there and meet up with you and drop our atomic bombs on you. Or it could have been some other reason, right? Like we want them to do something else. So based on my research in this 40-page paper I just put together, I think that action was, we wanted to use the media as a conduit for strategic deception, where we wanted the Russian agents in the United States, these are KGB agents and GRU agents, who, by the way, at this time, were using the media as their primary source of intelligence. Because what happened, just to sort of go back a little bit, in 1945, we had a couple of Russian agents that defected. And as soon as the Americans realized how vast the Soviet espionage network was in the US, the FBI really cracked down and started shadowing every known Soviet agent in the US, which prevented them from recruiting new sources or from going out there and just, driving out to a military installation to gather intelligence. So what you see here is that the KGB and the GRU agents that were in the US at the time, in 1947, their primary source of intelligence was the US media. So I think what we were doing there is we were planning these flying saucer stories, and not only very specific stories, because we wanted to sort of hit that anxiety trigger point for Stalin. Remember, in April of 47, he was super anxious about not having these advanced aerial weapons. He was super anxious because he didn't have the atomic bomb at the time. So if he even speculated or thought that the Americans were doing something even more advanced than the atomic bomb, as the Snodgrass story, the super weapon story, sort of hinted at, that would have meant tasking his agents to take that information that it was gleaning from the media and to urgently transmit it back to Moscow. And what we've since found out is that the Russians were very limited in how they could communicate with Moscow. They only really had two options at their disposal if they didn't want the Americans to know what they were sending back. They could either go down to the local RCA, ITT, or Western Union office and send it across as a telegram, an enciphered telegram, an encrypted telegram, or they could drop it into a diplomatic pouch and hop on a plane or hop on a ship and personally take it back through courier. Well, when you're asking for urgent intelligence, obviously you're going to take the quickest route, which in this case would have been by sending these enciphered telegrams. And what was happening behind the scenes is these American telegraph companies were giving American codebreakers a copy of every single telegram that was being sent across. And those telegrams were exploited by the Americans in what later became known as the Venona Project, where they were specifically looking to break the Soviet diplomatic code, because it wasn't just Russian embassy workers who were using that code. It was also those KGB and GRU agents. And so we were really looking to try to expose the extent of our counterintelligence nightmare back in 1947.
Thank you. And I have a number of comments and questions, but I also want to ask you, Erica, do you have any comments or questions or thoughts at this
Yeah, I
stage?
mean, it's just fascinating to hear James, to hear you talk, and Jack and I, like I mentioned at the beginning of the show, this is an area of great interest to us. And when you really do the research and you step back and you look at the patterns, you look at the way, you know, this kind of disinformation or different stories get planted in the media. I mean, it just is such a, it seems it's very simple when you look at it from a higher viewpoint. And, you know, at the end of the show, I definitely want to get your opinions on how you think that plays today. And if if those things are still at play, but I love it.
Well, I think it's probably good time to delve into the state of UFO research, because I'm not sure if all your viewers know that I was the former director of MUFON, and so was heavily involved in UFO research from 1997 all the way to 2009 or 2010 when I resigned my position. But what has always struck me during those years and since is how little progress has been made. And I think one of the primary reasons for that, well, I think there's two major reasons. One reason is that most people who study UFOs or who are really into UFOs are really just report collectors. They love collecting data. MUFON being the principal, right? They love to get that information coming in through their CMS database, but then they sit on it and they do nothing with it. They don't form hypotheses. They don't try to see what the data is telling them. And I'm not just limiting these to the UFO organizations. There are other folks and researchers out there too that all they do is gather data. Well, if you're just gathering data, to me, that's absolutely useless. You have to be able to take the data you have and make sense out of it. And when you're trying to make sense out of it, it's important that you really, if you're trying to at least take a scientific approach, is you have to do like what archaeologists do, right? Think about when an archaeologist, starts trying to excavate a site. Well, they know that site, there's probably stratification going on there. There's probably been civilization after civilization after civilization has built in that same area. So they know that when they go in there, they have to be very careful. When they start digging down, they have to go layer by layer to be able to first to date things and to know which civilization did what when, till they get down to bedrock or whatever the bottom is. But they very carefully approach it to make sure they're gathering all the data very systematically. They don't take a backhoe approach, which is they don't go in with a big backhoe and just start digging and dumping it somewhere and trying to sift through it. But that is what UFO research has been. It's been a big backhoe approach where folks just go in and start digging and they start putting things together. And, pretty soon it's, the aliens built the pyramids and now we have the Tic Tac. There must be some relationship between them. And I've always said, you cannot approach UFO research that way. You have to be able to stratify. You have to be able to look at time slices of history.
Right.
And I emphasize this, I think, or try to emphasize this in my paper, that when somebody reads my paper, just think about 1947. Don't think about what happened before. Don't think about what happened after, because I don't have answers for those previous periods, nor do I pretend to. So could we have been visited in the past by aliens? Absolutely. Could we be visited in the future or in the 1950s? Maybe. But in 1947, we weren't visited. And I think my research speaks loud and clear that, and specifically that very specific time frame, both in 1946 and 1947, we are looking at a Cold War operations going on, not alien visitation.
Absolutely. And I think and sorry to interrupt you, Jack, but I just think that's, we're in, as you mentioned, in this topic as researchers, quote unquote researchers, we're either there to, you've got the debunkers or you've got the true believers. And neither of those sides are really willing to look at the facts in the matter and understand that this is a layered situation. And I'm surprised also, and I want to get your opinion on this, how many researchers don't take into account that there are these intelligence operations going on. I mean, you would think that would be the first thing that they would be kind of looking at.
You would think, but I think, you really have to look at it from the mindset of basically a Cold War warrior. and even folks who even have intelligence backgrounds sometimes miss that point, because I think they're sort of, their minds are already made up in terms of what their favorite hypothesis is. But I think you mentioned debunkers and you mentioned believers. Let's not forget the perpetuators. And the perpetuators are those folks that don't care about the truth. They don't care if we ever solve this mystery. They love the mystery. They want to perpetuate it. They just like to keep it rolling for whatever reason, whether it triggers those endorphins for them or it makes them money in some way. There are a number of folks in the UFO field that are perpetuators. And to me, that's actually a worse category than either believers or skeptics.
Yeah, there's at
Absolutely.
least some sincerity with the former two.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Go ahead, Eric.
No, Jack, I think you had some questions that I kind of went off a middle of the thing. So
Oh, it's a broad topic,
it is.
and to get to the meat that is on the bones, it does get complicated. Erica and I recently did a show on some of our research into NICAP and Cold War intelligence agencies and what can be conclusively drawn from FOIA requests and documents that James had an influence on my research practices from watching his research. And it does get complicated to lay out. And I think a lot of people want to avoid that or don't have the patience for it, especially if when they come to it, they just want to hear about UFOs.
Yeah.
And there aren't any I'm sorry, guys, a lot of some of the specific stories we're focusing on don't have a UFO in them. They just have intelligence officials talking about UFOs in them.
I have a good analogy for that. I was thinking about this the other day. And for some of you who are cat lovers like me, you know how you get a laser pointer and you can point it and your cats go chasing after it. And I kind of feel like that's what the whole UFO field is. It's a bunch of cats running after laser points, because a cat never stops to say, what is the source of that light? Where is that coming from? Why am I chasing this? Does it only happen when there's a human in the room? Is he waving his arms around when he does it? Is he laughing and smiling when he does it? The cats don't ask themselves that question. They in it for the thrill of the chase, for those endorphins that are flooding their brains. And I think a lot of folks, it's the same thing with UFOs, right? Whatever the new shiny object is, they're going to go after that. And they don't stop and ask themselves, are there problems with this narrative? Are there things like red flags to look at? Are there anachronisms? Which is huge from my perspective. Actually, I was reading the congressional testimony for David Grush when he went before Congress, and he made those very fantastical claims. And immediately what jumped out at me was a huge anachronism, because the first thing he said was, oh yeah, I was involved on behalf of my agency in the UAP task force from 2019. And then I thought, wait a minute, 2019, the UAP task force wasn't in existence then. It didn't come into existence until 2020. So why is nobody talking about that? It's a major anachronism. Maybe he had a faulty memory, could be, but it's still a red flag that needs to be looked into. And a lot of times we're so enamored of that shiny new object that we completely ignore the red flags.
Well, and I think too, this group of people, I mean, obviously it's the same group of people, coupled new fresh faces, every 5 years they're going to trot out. But I think that, they're so good at kind of, throwing something out here and over there. And then, by the time it's like our current political climate, by the time there's so much out there, you never even know where to focus, and I think people in the UFO world who've been manipulating it for their own gain or for whatever reason are very adept at doing that. So if there is an inconsistency, we're just going to move along to the next thing.
Exactly. It's the attention spans are just not there to be able to absorb and to actually comprehend. But you talked about complexity, Jack, and I completely agree with you, because as I was prepping for this show, I was thinking, okay, how could I take what's in my paper and present it to the folks that are watching this in a concise way that they would understand? And the more I started trying to do that, The more complicated it became, I thought, this is not possible. I cannot sit here and tell somebody how this works. I have to show them how it worked. So I actually put together this PowerPoint presentation that I'm going to convert into a YouTube video. That's going to basically walk them step by step and show the conciseness in that manner, because trying to put into words doesn't, on a show like this, doesn't give it justice. And pretty soon people start tuning out and they're like, oh God, that sounds so boring. And now I can't really figure that out. You got to show them, and you got to show that it's, what the data is showing too.
Right.
Yeah.
And to me, like, I just think it's so fascinating. Like, I mean, okay, I've got it. UFOs are, they're not extraterrestrial, whatever. Like, I've learned a lot, and I still have had experiences I can't explain. I don't know what that is, but I just think, to me, to delve into this aspect of it, that is more fascinating to me than looking for little green men.
Well, it actually opens up a big Pandora's box. I mean, if we really think about it, we were manipulating the media back in 1947. Is that not of concern to a democratic society? And is that what's trying to be hidden and obfuscated by all of these efforts we see in Congress? Maybe there's some garbage that we don't really want to show. So let's focus the public's attention to the shiny object and not focus on the fact that, there are things in our history that when actually revealed shows that, there's some dirty garbage there.
Yeah, like I've read where James proposed the idea that even if his theories are correct, there's still the possibility that it didn't work out as well as the architects of the operations were hoping. And I couldn't help but think that that's a pretty good reason to keep it classified and shredded in itself, that so much trouble came out of the UFO topic that if the intelligence community had certainly assisted in perpetuating and cultivating it, and then if the reasons weren't even productive, that certainly wouldn't be something that they would want to wave a flag about, to say the least.
Very true.
But okay, so we had German scientists, in particular, a couple that was working on a disc-like weapons delivery system. Then we know that Project SEAL was misrepresented as a current top secret weapons project, flying a weapon. Then you were explaining how the Russians became increasingly dependent on American media for an intelligence source, because there were a lot of undercover FBI operations going on. This was a time in history that spy rings were getting arrested and rolled up. My research shows that some of the intelligence officers adjacent to NICAP circumstances even briefed Alan Dulles later on spy rings and things, which is extremely interesting to me. But the Russians were depending on American media as at least one source of intelligence as they were trying to lay low and not get caught as spies, and that they were dependent on telegrams as a means of communication. So please tell us a little more about Project Shamrock and how this could have fallen into place is what made you start seeing this in your research.
Sure, absolutely. So Project Shamrock was basically an agreement between the U.S. government and the telegraph agencies. When I say the U.S. government, certain individuals in government, like James Forrestal, who was the Secretary of the Navy and then the first Secretary of Defense. He basically went to the telegraph companies because they were worried that they were doing something illegally. by taking all the telegrams being sent outside the US and providing copies to the American codebreakers. And so he reassured them and said, hey guys, don't worry, I got your back. Keep feeding us all of that information, whether it's illegal or not, I don't care. We need that information. So American codebreakers, which at the time, this was not the NSA, these were the predecessors of the NSA. We have the Army Security Agency, so these were military organizations. We have the Navy's OP-20G, which was the naval codebreakers. They were the recipients of these telegrams. And what they found out was that normally the system that the Soviets used, which was based on something called a one-time pad. So for those folks who are interested, once I got my video up there on YouTube, I'll walk you through all of this step by step. Any sort of encipherment or any sort of cryptography based on a one-time pad, if properly done, is an unbreakable code. I mean, unbreakable even now and unbreakable in the future. The nature of a one-time pad encryption system is such that there is no computer powerful enough now or in the future that could break this. So if they had actually adhered to the proper use of a one-time pad for encrypting their telegrams, we wouldn't be talking right now, right? Essentially, the code breakers would have gone nowhere. But what happened was the Russians screwed up. During the war, they took their one-time pad system, and for a one-time pad, there should only be one pair of each one-time pad. So basically, you take two copies of these one-time pads, were just a bunch of random 5-digit numbers, and you give one copy, it's like a booklet of codes. You give one copy to the person sending a message, you give one copy to the person receiving the message, and they use that to encrypt their communication, and the guy who has the equivalent one-time pad can decrypt it. And if there only existed one pair of that pad, it would be unbreakable. But what happened is that during the war, because of wartime pressures, they ended up duplicating their one-time pads. So now instead of 2 copies of a pad page, there were 4 copies. And so it could be that there's a KGB agent in New York and a KGB agent in San Francisco, both using the same one-time pad, encrypting messages, sending them back to Moscow. So the Americans quickly figured out, this was actually back in 1943, they figured out that there was this duplication issue. And they figured that out because when they were using these pads, they would usually take the first 5 digits from the pad and they would start their message out with it in clear text. So all they had to do was see that a message that was telegrammed from New York to Moscow and another that was telegrammed from San Francisco to Moscow had the first 5 digits the same. And they would go, oh, wow, those 2 messages are what was called in cryptographic terms in depth, and which is a major no-no for a one-time pad system. And if they're in depth, that means they can be exploited, which is exactly what the whole Venona project was based on, was exploiting that Soviet screw up.
Fascinating. I've got to say too that as I continued to digest this, and James lays out in his work a term known in the intelligence community as gardening. And that is, well, I'll ask you. You explain it, please, James.
Sure. So what gardening is what's called a known plain text attack. So basically, what I want to do is I want to put information out there in clear text that I want my enemy to take and to encrypt it, so that I can intercept it. And because I know what the plain text is, I can use that in the case of this one-time pad screw up to break other messages, the other messages that we're using the same pad. So we're using a known text to break an unknown text. Now, this has precedent in history going back to World War II, because the British used it to break the Enigma code. And we use it as well to actually win the Battle of Midway, which is a fascinating story in and of itself. So let me explain the Midway story because it's actually pretty easy. So essentially, the American cryptographers had intercepted this Japanese message saying, our fleet is headed towards location AF, Alpha Foxtrot. And the Americans said, well, we don't know what AF is. It could be anywhere in the Pacific Ocean. But let's do this. We think it's Midway Island. So let's put this to the test. What they did is they sent out a radio message in plain text, that's the chosen plain text, saying Midway is having a problem with a desalination plant. We don't have fresh water. Now, the Japanese received that plain text message. They turned around and encrypted another message that we intercepted and decrypted. And in their message, it says, oh, AF is having a problem with fresh water. Now we know where they're headed towards. And that's how we won the Battle of Midway.
Brilliant. Absolutely brilliant.
Yeah.
So we have these weapons programs. They were potentially the Russians that Stalin wanted to know more about, wanted to get this German couple. The American intelligence may have been misrepresenting it in the press. Then when messages, Russian messages are intercepted, it would increase American opportunities to break their code and understand their messages by looking for names like flying saucer, Roswell, various proper nouns that would be in the codes.
Yeah, and even more specifically, it would have been anglicized names. So the more anglicized names that we could entice the KGB to send in their encrypted messages, the more cribs we had to break the other messages that were in depth with that one. Because what we're ultimately trying to do is we were trying to recreate out of thin air something called the Soviet codebook. So it's again, this is the complicated part, which I think you really need to watch my video for to understand it. But basically, the Russians had three layers of security. First, they would never actually name their agents by their real names. So if you, Jack, were a Soviet agent, I may give you a cover name of Skipper, right? You kind of look like a ship's captain, so I'll call you Skipper. So if I wanted to mention you in an encrypted message, I would never say Jack Brewer, right? If I was a Russian KGB agent, I would say Skipper. And when it got to Moscow, everybody in Moscow would know, oh yeah, Skipper, that's the cover name for Jack Brewer. They also gave locations these cover names, like San Francisco was called Babylon, and the Manhattan Project was called Enormous. And so they would use these cover names. And I kind of think of it like on The Sopranos. You know, in The Sopranos, they would talk to each other on the phone. They would always talk to each other in that mafia code. Like, hey, Christopher, I need 5 boxes of ziti. And that meant bring me $5,000 to my house, right? They talked in this sort of code, right? So the Russians did the same thing. They had cover names. That was sort of the first layer of obfuscation. But then when they actually wanted to send a message, they had something called the Soviet code book. And this code book had like 10,000 words in it. So whenever they were creating their message, they would say, okay, I need to send this message out, but I'm going to find for each of those words a corresponding 4-digit number from this code book. So they would then encode the message using these 4-digit codes. And the final layer was using that one-time pad to then put the encipherment layer on there, which was that unbreakable layer, assuming that they had done it right. So it's 3 layers of obfuscation. So very difficult for any cryptographer to be able to break into. But based on that Soviet screw up, we were able to make inroads into that, and we were able to get back and actually recover some of the messages. Not a lot, but we were able to actually decrypt quite a few of those messages, including, for example, in 1946, we figured out that the Russians were sending a whole list of names of scientists from the Manhattan Project. So we knew they were super interested in the atomic bomb project. And of course, that led to the whole, Russian spies like Julius Rosenberg, who for a long time said people would say he's innocent. No, Venona decode show he was a Russian spy, and other folks that had infiltrated the Manhattan Project on behalf of the Russians. But what I'm trying to get back to is why these anglicized names are important. Because we didn't know what the Russian code book will look. We know there was 10,000 words in there. We didn't know what those words were. We had to basically recreate that code book from scratch. You got a fan there, Erica.
I know. Honey's here.
But we did know one thing. We knew from the code book what the spell table was. And let me explain what the spell table is. The spell table was used when they were encoding their messages to spell out a word that didn't exist in the code book. So, like, for example, Jack's cover name is Skipper. Well, if I look in those 10,000 words, I don't have a word for Skipper. So I'm going to have to spell it out letter by letter, Skipper, using these different codes. And we knew how to break that. So if we could embed into those planted messages as many anglicized names as possible, we could easily grab the code groups from those that would help us break the other message we were really trying to break, which had intelligence value.
So
Fascinating. As I continued to read your work over the years and digest it, and when you become familiar enough with something that you might then recognize aspects of it somewhere else, it began to affect me in that way. I think a number of people may have read part of your blogs or read some of your book or heard you on an interview occasionally, but I don't think that, in my opinion, a lot of people have digested your work to the point that it may stick with them when they see a circumstance later. And as an example of that, I'd like to bring up for consideration that when I was researching NICAP, and I'm finding these complex, as we've said, connections between a PR firm, counsel services, and an economic cooperation administration, which was a covert government agency that was an asset of the CIA. Well, this counsel services eventually in 1956 incorporated NICAP. But prior to that, I found that back when they were working directly with the CIA, they also had a client named Colonel Amos, who was a retired, quote unquote, CIA officer. And he published a newsletter and was a high profile in the media former CIA officer. And at a time in history when they were exchanging international letters and things, a counsel services member, Mary Von King, and Colonel Amos, I came across at that same point in time, 1952, when Colonel Amos returned to the States. He reported a UFO sighting that he was not a part of, just a story that was going around Baltimore, to the Air Force Office of Special Investigations. It ended up in Project Blue Book. And I obtained the file on it that has this poor intelligence officer trying to figure out what's going on that was from OSI. And one of the things that he wrote about was that Colonel Amos did not claim to have seen the UFO or anything. He just knew about it, wanted to bring it to their attention. And the way he said he knew about it was that a reporter that worked at a Baltimore radio station named Lewis Corbin had told him about it. Now, this also ends up tying into counsel services because they had connections with local media as one of the reasons they were attractive to NICAP and Townsend Brown. Staying with the UFO report, however, Colonel Amos told the investigator from OSI some names of people that were witnesses and knew about the sighting. And a couple of these names, George and John Mason, who were supposed to be father and son, did not exist. And from reading the report, it seems that Amos suggested he heard the story from Lewis Corbin at the radio station. And the OSI investigator followed up with Corbin, who said, no, I never heard of them, which to me is saying, no, I didn't tell Amos that. Now, to circle back to reading your research enough for it to become more internalized, that would seem rather inexplicable and just kind of one of those, what the hell is this CIA guy giving the Air Force a heads up about a UFO sighting that turned out to be a hoax, by the way, anyway? And how come there's extra names in it that seem to have entered the story with the CIA guy? Your work seems to offer some ideas of how that seems a lot less inexplicable than it may have. It's also interesting to me that 1952 time frame was just before the big DC flap that they had, and a number of things in that era that make it a little less peculiar to me that a CIA officer is inserting himself in UFO narratives that admittedly didn't even have anything to do with the story initially.
Well, it's interesting because all of that is ambiguity, right? And I think a lot of folks have problems with the UFO field, especially if you're like a scientist or you're a historian, because you can't deal with the ambiguity, right? You can't deal with this constant back and forth about, is this guy, what he's saying, true? Is it not true? It's like the whole Lou Elizondo, fiasco. Was he a member of AATIP? Was he not a member of AATIP? It's kind of like they built in this ambiguity, because the built-in ambiguity will sort of turn off those folks who are scientifically minded and who are looking for patterns and who are looking for some data to grasp on. And as soon as they start hitting this wall of ambiguity, they're like, okay, that's enough. I can't deal with this anymore. And it's noise. What it is it's injected noise. And if you look at the history of ufology, noise injection has always been a big part of it. Now, how that ties in with my research, let's take, for example, what I keep calling strategic deception. There are different types of strategic deception. One of them is what's called an ambiguity increasing deception, where you're putting information out that sort of just baffles your enemy. They don't know what to make of it. They can't make sense of it, but they do know they have to pay attention to it. And they do know they have to do something, or they may have to act upon it, but they may not know that the action that they're performing is exactly the action you want them to perform. That's the whole purpose of it. It's kind of like if you think about during World War II, when we wanted, we basically with the Brits, or I should say the Brits did this, they took that body and they dumped it off of a submarine with an attached briefcase, because they wanted the Germans to take the documents in that briefcase and look at it and go, oh, wait, it looks like they're going to be attacking here. Is that really where they're going to be attacking? Yeah, I think so. So they sent all their forces that way, and they're not sending the forces where we're really attacking. So it's that ambiguity that your enemy has to be forced to deal with. And I think if you look at the only common thread throughout all of UFO history that I've seen from the time I started researching this until now, is there's a thread of human deception involved. And when you start tugging on that thread, you start finding all kinds of weird stuff. And for a lot of folks, they can't wrap their mind around that. They're like, well, what's the purpose of the deception, right? Why do we have Mellon and Semivan and Elizondo and Bigelow and Stratmore and all these other guys doing all these weird, strange things that really don't make a lot of sense to us? Well, there's an ultimate reason for it. We just don't understand it, right? It's purposely injected in the field because to create that wall of ambiguity.
Yes, your statements kind of turned my thoughts to General Albert Wiedemeyer on on this, that he was an advisor to NICAP, and James found a clipping that he sent us that was in an old NICAP journal, in which, when Wiedemeyer stated publicly that he was withdrawing from the organization, resigning from its board of advisors, there was a clipping in one of the journals that stated that it was because his name was never supposed to have been published as being involved with NICAP, which is, you know, could be interpreted as a particularly odd thing to say. And he was a well-connected high intelligence official, a member of the war planning board that would have known intimately about or potentially known intimately about any deception operations and D-Day and involvement in that. And I would like to read a quote here from him that he told the Committee on Un-American Activities in or about 1958. It was in a document that was published in 1958. And he stated, "There are four major categories of resources: political, economic, psychological, and military. If the first of these resources, that is political, economic, and psychological, are employed intelligently and boldly in consonance with a well thought out plan, it may never be necessary to use actively our military force." Obviously, that is exactly what we should do at all times. And I in my opinion, that says a lot.
It says everything. I absolutely agree. I think if you look, because I point this out in some of my work too, but if you look at the principles that were involved in the strategic deception in 1947, these were folks that came out of World War II, having witnessed the horrors and the atrocities of World War II, the millions of people who died, and who looked at the tools of deception and thought, you know what? Yeah, we can put out words, and those words can prevent wars. We can put out ideas, and those ideas will prevent wars. So anything that you can do to prevent a hot war from erupting is worth it. And I think in their case, even if it meant deceiving your own people in the process, because in order to perpetuate deception in 1947, we not only had to deceive the Russians, we had to deceive the Americans as well. And we're not just talking the general public, we're talking about people in the military, right, who weren't privy to that deception was going on.
I know Erica and I too have a number of questions about more current circumstances, but before we move along, I'd just like to ask you, is there anything in particular you would say might be most important for people to understand about that 1946-47 era in your research?
Oh, sure. Yeah, so I basically put out two books. One was called Anachronism, which covered the 1946 ghost rockets, and the other one was the Roswell Deception, which covered the summer of 47. You can download them for free. I don't sell them. There are links you can click in them to go to the original raw documentation, so you can look at it for yourself. But what I'm always struck with, and I think every UFO researcher, or even serious researcher, is going to run into this, is that without data to back up your hypothesis and your theory, it's just another theory. So anybody reading my book can go, oh, another conspiracy theory, right? Just like we get tired of the JFK conspiracy theories and all the books that are written and nobody actually gets to the truth. So that has bothered me to no end ever since I finished publishing my books. And I thought, you know what, I got to figure out a way to put some meat on these bones and to come up with some data that's going to show, there's something here that somebody, serious scientific researchers need to look at. So just this year, this is where I started using the tools of artificial intelligence to help me get to that point. And so what I want to point out is that, and you'll see this in the YouTube video that I'm going to create, but you're also going to see it when the article gets published, actually submitted to the Journal of Intelligence and Counterintelligence, is that if we take, for example, the hypothesis that the Americans planted flying saucer stories in 1947, well, how do you prove that? Well, one way you can prove it is to look at it from a cryptoanalytic point of view. Is there something about those articles that are anomalous as compared to other newspaper articles? And that's where I started doing research on things like letter frequency anomalies, right? When you write English text, there's a certain number of expected times a letter should appear. Like, some letters more than others. Well, when I started doing analysis of these flying saucer articles, I found out that the majority of them, as compared to other texts, have letter frequency anomalies. Why would that be? Well, if they were purposely created and planted for cryptoanalytic attack, that would make sense. So some researcher, somebody else can look at that and go, well, there's an anomaly there that I can further research. Or if you look at it in terms of, why are the anglicized names in these flying saucer articles, how do they match up, for example, to the Soviet cover names for agents that we know about today? Well, we have information we didn't have back then. We know a large number of the cover names that were being used by the Russians. And when you start doing comparison between those and those flying saucer articles, you get a large number of hits that are anomalous, that are of statistical significance. So that's where you start getting the data. If you can show the data to be statistically significant to back up your hypothesis, that's putting meat on the bones.
Absolutely. And what I'm going to bring up now is getting a little out of 101 and going more into some advanced aspects of it. And that's okay. I'm all for diving as deep as we want to go. When I was writing on the UFO trail a few years ago about people I was identifying adjacent to the NICAP figures and documents I was getting from FBI records, from different archives and things like that, a researcher named Mary Watts contacted me and asked me, was I aware of how involved some of these figures were in MK Ultra and CIA activities? And I was not. I was just, branching out from UFO stuff. So she and I began corresponding. And this is again about how James's research, after I began to internalize it, I began potentially seeing it in other places. One of the things that Ms. Watts brought up to me that she found curious is she said she had a lot of newspaper clippings from the era about some of these men's activities. And sometimes in different regions of the country, there would be a name added that wasn't in the other AP stories. Or there would be a misspelling that could, of course, be random, but she just found it curious that, one article might include Georgetown University wing, and then the rest of them didn't. And she wondered why that would be if it was simply coming off the AP wire, that it seemed like it should have been relatively the same story. So kind of leapfrogging off that, James, would you talk a little about, along with the code breaking activities, what purposes gardening and planning stories in the press with misspellings and things might have?
Sure. Yeah, we can go back to the infamous Roswell press release. If you examine the Associated Press version of that press release as compared to the United Press, they're different. Now, if the 509 bomb group decided to put out a press release, why didn't they put out a single press release? Why are they putting out two different press releases with different details in them? So that's
absolutely
right there. There's a purpose behind there that looks to be of code breaking significance. Or if you start examining the different versions, the AP version of an article to a UP version, you start seeing flying saucer witness names misspelled, completely redone. Like one time this guy's called John and the other time he's called Frank. I mean, there are just things that look at, you look at it, you go, this really is odd. You know, could the newspapers have really made that level of mistakes? Well, there's another avenue of investigation. Let's take, for example, that I take all the flying saucer articles from 1947 and I say, okay, let's go through and do a comparison between them all. Let's find out all the times proper names were misspelled in one as opposed to another, or changed completely from one to the other. And let's come up with a ratio of that, right? The error ratio for that. Now let's take AP articles and UP articles from other mundane stories, and let's compare the error rate there. And that as a point of comparison is good, significant data, right? It can tell you there's an anomaly there that needs to be looked at.
Absolutely. It's so fascinating. And again, like these are little aspects of things. Well, not little aspects, but where other people would just completely gloss over or marginalize these inconsistencies, but yet they could be key to so much.
But I think it's because they're focused on the shiny object.
Right.
Right. We've seen this. It's one of the reasons why I left MUFON, is because time and time again, I would see MUFON investigators specifically ignore red flags. Right. They would talk to a witness and these major red flags would start popping up and they would completely ignore them. They would gloss over them because they were so focused on the shiny object, which was, is there a reality to what this person's telling me, that they didn't stop to think about, you know, that investigating those red flags is super important because there may be a hoax going on, there may be some misrepresentation going on, there may be some embellishment going on. And I'm not saying all UFO witnesses are that way. There are folks that just genuinely tell you honestly what they saw and what they think they saw. But if you want to investigate the subject, if your sole focus is on the shiny object, then that's where your attention's drawn, and you're going to miss all the other things that are important, that are glaring. And I think, you know, I was actually talking to a MUFON member. You probably know him, Erica Ruben Uriarte.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I was talking to Ruben last night. He called me after we had lost touch, and we were talking about MUFON and the state of MUFON. And I said, hey, Ruben, why has MUFON never asked me to come to one of their symposiums and present my research? Am I not talking about UFOs here? Am I not talking scientifically about UFOs here? But I think that's where you get back to, is MUFON truly scientifically minded or not?
Well, I spent the past week like looking over some of the symposium, you know, all the different symposium information that they put out, and I just think no, really any scientific. There was not.
And
maybe there was back in the 70s a little teeny bit, but it just was.
Sometimes there is the semblance of science,
right?
Right. There's a semblance of science, which is fine, because at least you're trying science. But when you completely ignore a theory or hypothesis because it's not the extraterrestrial hypothesis or it's not the interdimensional hypothesis, if you completely ignore it, how is that being scientific minded?
Right. And when you already have your assumption, your mind made up, then there's no chance of, you know, science even being involved at all, which is what I have seen. I think most of us with MUFON. I mean, everybody's mind is made up, and not a lot of people in the subject in at a whole are actually willing to look at all the other evidence, which is too bad, because I love educating myself. I love learning new things. I'm okay to admit that I'm wrong, you know, and I think people need to be like that when they're really pursuing this topic.
And I think you have to be open. I mean, I'm still fascinated by abduction stories. You know, I'm fascinated by some UFO stories, historical accounts out there. I'm not saying that my Cold War and intelligence research is an answer for all that we've seen or heard. I mean, I'm open-minded enough to know that this is a big universe, and more than likely there's life out there. And the question is, has that life reached Earth? Possibility. Right? You have to be open-minded. That's a possibility. So again, I'm not trying to advocate that my research is an answer to all UFO and UAP stories. No, absolutely not. But what I am saying is that you have to look discreetly at each time slice, right, and at each case, and you have to just focus specifically on that one point in time, and try to come up with whatever hypothesis best explain it. Again, from my perspective, I think 1946, 1947, Cold War explains it perfectly.
Yeah, and there's a lot of aspects of James's work that set good examples of research practices. I mean, as he's alluding to, and like you're getting at, Erica, I can just hear the people saying, well, what about the 1800s airships? And what about this? And what about that? Well, he wasn't talking about 1800s airships. He was talking about General Wiedemeyer in 1952 or something like that. And he did, more literally focus on 1946, 47. And I think that's something as researchers we would be wise to take to heart, that there's too much information, there's too many circumstances to try to address just UFOs or the CIA or the intelligence community. And it's been manipulated not only by professional intelligence officers that are the best in the world at what they do, but it's also been manipulated by charlatans and disingenuous people with a number of ulterior motives, so that there's even a certain inherent quality to it to keep people off track and pull the rug out from under them. And the ambiguity that we were talking about, indeed. I think with that, we could kind of migrate the discussion to some of the more current circumstances going on. And I know anytime that James Carrion makes a public appearance and discusses his work and his insights, people always want to know about different things that happened at MUFON. And one of the things I can say that most impacted me was during a time when a star team had been assembled and Bigelow was giving money to the organization, and there was turmoil on the board, and the people I knew, I'm sure Erica personally knew some as well, people involved in those projects I had telling me they believed the organization had been infiltrated. They believed that there was a CIA or an NSA or some agenda involved. Now, granted, the majority of the people, if not all, that I spoke with thought it had something to do with hiding UFOs, that they were getting too close to the truth, that something's going on. But the interesting aspect of this to me is their conspiracy ideas basically got confirmed, that eventually it was shown that Robert Bigelow was acting as a funding conduit for an intelligence agency, probably the DIA, maybe the NSA, whoever specifically was writing the check or transferring the money that then he was giving to MUFON, was shown to be correct. And it's my interpretation that I'm confident of that Robert Bigelow obstructed that knowledge from public awareness. Would you agree with that, James? And would you speak to that circumstance?
Sure, absolutely. So if we backtrack to 2008, when Bigelow first started BAASS, he came to MUFON and said, hey, I got this sponsor, got plenty of money. They want BAASS to be able to investigate UFOs, and we want to subcontract MUFON to help us in that investigation. So I met with the MUFON board, because I was director at the time, put together a presentation to show how we could help do UFO investigations, rapid response investigations using the STAR team, and putting boots on the ground quickly with enough, if we had the funds to do it. And I went to Bigelow's headquarters in Las Vegas. We presented it to him and to other folks that were present in the room, which included folks like Jacques Vallée and Pudov and some folks that I didn't recognize and were never introduced to me. And we said, yeah, we could definitely do this. You give us enough money, we'll put boots on the ground for you wherever you need them. But Mr. Bigelow, looking at him point blank and saying, whose money is it? And if you can't tell us whose money is it, at least tell me it's not an intelligence agency. And he said, no, it's not an intelligence agency. Well, so he lied to my face, essentially, because it turns out, fast forward, we come to find out, yes, it was an intelligence agency. It was the Defense Intelligence Agency. So he was obfuscating that. He was hiding that. The only person probably in MUFON that may have known it was DIA was John Schuessler, but only because he had a close relationship with Bigelow and he was offered a security clearance for whatever reason. Nobody else on the board was asked to get a security clearance, just Mr. Schuessler. So yeah, that was obfuscated. And, that so definitely rubbed me the wrong way later on when I found out it was DIA, because that sort of confirmed my belief after I left MUFON. But there were other things I think folks need to understand that, if you look at the history of BAASS and you look at AATIP and how this all started, where does it really, really go back to? And where it really goes back to is Skinwalker Ranch. And why Skinwalker Ranch? Good question, because Skinwalker Ranch is basically a myth-making machine. And when I was in MUFON and at the very end of MUFON, there were things about Skinwalker Ranch that just didn't sound right to me, which is why I flew out to Utah and tried to get on it and was denied, which is fine. Bigelow's prerogative not to let me on the ranch. But just some of the things that came out from that told me there's more than meets the eye here with Skinwalker Ranch. And so if we look again at the history of deception, if you start tugging on that string, and you start going, even today, right? If we look at the congressional hearings, if we look at the Aero office, if we look at the UAP task force, you start tugging on that thread's going to go back to Skinwalker Ranch. And so if it's born in deception, what does it tell you about the current situation?
Right. And there was never, to my knowledge, and I looked into this quite a bit, but there was never any instrumentation at the ranch to do anything. This was like a bare bones, half-assed, half-baked situation. And so what do you think was really going on? Why were they focusing on a place where nothing was really going on, creating that myth? Not only that, but saying that it's top secret, but then putting it out in publication after publication, and all of these things that just always just, let's make sure you advertise that right away.
So going back to my cat analogy, Erica, if you think about it, whoever the folks are that are in the know, I don't know who they are, right? There are folks in this, I don't call it the deep state because I think that's a misnomer and I don't think it exists. I think there are folks in intelligence circles who are controlling the narrative. And wherever they shine that laser pointer and everybody runs to, chasing after it, it's the new shining location, right? So Skinwalker Ranch is one of those, right? Shine the laser pointer there, everybody runs to it. It's anomalous, it's ambiguous. We don't know why it's happening. Okay, well, then from Skinwalker Ranch, let's shine it onto Congress. And from Congress, let's shine it onto the Navy and the UAP task force. And then from there to Aero. And from there to Elizondo and Mellon and Grush and all these other folks. So we constantly see this pushing of a narrative that's controlled for whatever the ultimate reason is. It could be, again, I think it's for national security reasons, right? Maybe we want to keep the Russians and the Chinese guessing what we're doing and why we're doing it, or it's one of these ambiguity increasing deceptions. Who knows? But if you just focus on the part that it's the ambiguity and the deception that's always key, that's always present, right? That's where you have to suspect what's really happening in today's UFO narrative.
Right. It is interesting. I mean, because that group of people, you named Bigelow and Putoff and Kelleher and Knapp, and I mean, they all, carefully crafted, or maybe not even carefully crafted, because some of the things when you read Hunt for the Skinwalker, you just look at and go, "Are you freaking kidding me?" But they've done a lot over the past few decades to find people that are going to promote their stories and keep all of that going. Do you think that some of these people that are involved are actually working on behalf of a foreign intelligence agency?
The usual suspects, probably not. When I say the usual suspects, I mean the Kellehers and the Bigelows, the Mellons, the Elizondos. I don't think so. I think there's foreign interest, but who's actually working on behalf of a foreign government? I couldn't tell, but I don't think it's any of those folks.
Okay. It is interesting to me, as you look back at Bigelow and you look at Coast to Coast and some of the people that have been promoted by this group of people early on, you always get a little bit of here we've got a ghost story, here's a shapeshifter, here's Roger Stone, or here's the head of the Oath Keepers, and then we know now with what's going on currently, like how much there are influences from foreign governments that are on YouTube or that are disseminating evidence for specific reasons, and that does have a little bit of overlap with the UFO conspiracy community. And so I just wonder how much of that, would go back if you looked at Bigelow and his chums.
Yeah, that would be interesting to trace back. I don't know how it ties in with the political situation right now. I mean, I know that Bigelow likes to fund certain Republican candidates to the tune of millions of dollars, but I don't know how far right he is, and if that ties into his whole ideology or philosophy.
And when he was, obviously he bought the MUFON database, what do you think that he was really looking for, if you had to guess?
Honestly, I don't think he was looking for anything. I think Bigelow is more like a Howard Hughes type, where in exchange for certain favors he does for the government, they do favors for him as well. Whether it's his space adventure, I think that's defunct now, or whatever it is, it could be a tax break for all we know. But I don't think he has that level of imagination. He's a businessman. I think if anything, his strings are being pulled by someone.
And what did you know? I've got to just go off on this one for a second, but what did you know of Prince Hans Adam and his involvement with any of these groups back in that time frame?
The only thing I remember from MUFON was that he funded the abduction, what was it called? The AMP project, where they were putting those boxes in abductee homes to record the ambient environment. It was the ambient monitoring project. I know he funded that, but I don't know of his involvement past that.
Okay, thank you.
Now's as good a time as any to mention that due to FOIA requests from researchers like us at EFR and others, the FBI has started intermittently releasing its records on the late Senator Harry Reid, and those are available at the FBI vault, and people can start reading those. And some of them are quite interesting. The initial ones coming out about the different activities and things that were going on. I think there's, obviously there's an agenda there's layers of agendas in these circumstances. There are a lot of people that get involved, and there's just about as many motives as there are people. And in my opinion, some of them could have foreign influence. Some of them could have American intelligence influence. I think some of them are just greedy. I think some of them see it as an advantageous career move to report or write about sensational things. I think that some of them just want attention. I think there's a lot of people that get involved in this that will ride coattails pretty much indiscriminately for reasons even not involving money or career moves. They just want attention and kind of do it as a hobby. So I think there's a lot going on here. And a specific example of that, a journal asked me if I would be willing to review one of those books that Knapp and Kelleher and Lukatsky did on what's supposedly an report on the AAWSAP and things that were going on in it. And so they provided me the book, so I read it. And we were talking about Bigelow obstructing where the funds came from, and the turmoil with MUFON that resulted, and the problematic aspects of it, not covered at all in their account of the AAWSAP and the BAASS collaboration with MUFON. To hear them tell it, it was a top-notch, tight ship all down the line. And I just, found that infuriatingly hilarious. We just rewrite history to our liking sometimes. And I know that in the archive community, that's some of the concern with that. It's not even gatekeeping as much as selective citation and confirmation bias, and make people out to be heroes that historians will show us they were Nazi supporters and things like that. Is just typical in this genre for all of the layers of reasons I mentioned, I think.
No, I absolutely agree. I mean, you read those books, starting with Hunt for the Skinwalker, and then Skinwalkers at the Pentagon. I'm not sure if there was a third one. Refresh my memory if there was. But it seems like a continuous narrative. It's like, to me, Hunt for the Skinwalker was just a myth-making machine, right? Put these ideas out there, don't corroborate them, don't show the data, just state it as a narrative and people will believe it. And I don't see anything different in Skinwalkers in the Pentagon. So, but why put out that narrative? That's the question. Why? Who benefits from this? Are they doing it for ego? Are they doing it for status? Or are they doing it for some other reason? I mean, whatever it is, foreign influence. But you were talking about foreign influence. I think it's highly interesting that we see, as Erica pointed out, how people like to make themselves known and to be always in the media. I think a prime example of that is like Elon Musk, right? He's out there saying the dumbest, stupidest, most ridiculous things because it gets.
But he looks good jumping up and down, though.
Yeah, it gives him airtime, right? And then we find out this, I think it was this week or last week, that he's been in constant contact with Vladimir Putin. I mean, okay, what is that about? Is that foreign influence? And I think Trump does the same thing. His thing is that outrage makes the news, right? So say things that are outrageous and say things that are just completely fantastical and unbelievable because you'll get media time. And I think that's what the UFO narrative is as well. The more sensational and shiny it is, the more airtime it gets. So do I think that my theories are going to be the front page of the New York Times? No, I don't, because it's mundane. It doesn't trigger those endorphins, and we're in a society right now where attention spans are looking for that instant gratification. And I think that maybe the powers to be, like the intelligence community, understands that, so they are manipulating it because they know how to manipulate it. They had enough experience with it already to know how they can take the narrative and they can push the narrative along, basically, whatever their choosing is, and for whatever reasons they're doing it for, they can control that narrative. And so I think, if you want to sum up the current UFO situation, I would tell you it's controlled narrative. That's what it is right now.
Yes, it's something. And I will definitely say to ask you, James, I know we've probably talked about this on the show before, but when you look at like Cambridge Analytica, and you look at the fact that you've got Steve Bannon involved. Steve Bannon is, in the same circles as certain people in the UFO community. I mean, could the purchase of the MUFON database, could have that been kind of a way to mine data and to figure out what makes a person prone to seeing specific things or reporting specific things? And then how could that person be manipulated? And it could, because to me, that's when you look at what's going on in social media and you look at what happened with Cambridge Analytica and the Facebook tests and profile testing and things like that. And then the way we've got our current, our politics, they're believing things that are not based in fact, but they've been given the same type of repetitive information, over and over, whether it's about JFK or whether it's about FEMA camps coming, all of this stuff. I mean, could that have been at play at all with what Bigelow was trying to do?
It could have been. I think if we look now at the advancements in artificial intelligence, for example, artificial intelligence needs constant data. It needs new data. In fact, there's this current narrative right now in the AI field about what happens when it runs out of data. What happens when it consumes all the data on the internet and there's no more to consume? Well, that's a concern. So I think that data mining, artificial intelligence, the intelligence community, they know there's value in data. Whether the data is your social media post or it's the MUFON database or whatever it is, there's value there because it allows you to look at data in ways you've never looked at it before. Whether that's can be used for foreign influence or for giving advantage to some political group, whatever the reasoning behind it, there's value in that data. And maybe that was maybe the government has leapfrogged us and they've been doing this artificial intelligence thing for a long time. We don't know. And so that purchase of the MUFON database was because they needed that data.
Okay, thank you.
You're reminding me now, the two of you, with this aspect of the discussion. There was an organization that launched within the past couple of years. The name escapes me. One of you will know it when I describe it. And it was the latest that was going to have an app that you do on your phone.
Enigma? Was it Enigma?
Enigma Labs. Thank you. And yes, that's it. And they wanted you to give them permission to be on their phone. And Erica and I had heard kind of behind the scenes of various databases, people that were holding databases or UFO archives that Enigma Labs was interested in accessing or purchasing. And one of the things that Jensine Andresen put forth about this, Dr. Andresen posited that when an organization or a group gets all of this data, that as James and Erica are saying, an AI needs more data, more things to keep mulling over. Depending on how your permission is granted, it's not limited to just formulating UFO stories. And any customer that it can get the AI to construct reports in a format that would be of interest to, from car sales to refrigerators you own, where you live, parts of the country you're in, or anything else, may create a potential form of revenue that they owe you no disclosure about if you've just given them that data. Sure. So there's all kinds of privacy issues at stake. And I agree with Dr. Andresen and Erica's implications with things like that. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Any more questions, Erica? Any other thoughts?
You know, I mean, I want to ask you, James, like what you think about Elizondo and that whole narrative, because it's, you know, you sit back and you look at it. I mean, obviously the big splash, New York Times, yada, yada, yada. But then from what I have gathered over the years, you know, Mr. Elizondo has gone out of his way to kind of find people and recruit people behind the scenes to carry on his information or to create allegedly online bully kind of communities for people. What do you make of what he could be doing with regard to this? Is he just another grifter? Is there an asset, or is he an intelligent, working on behalf of the intelligent community? I know you have to have a magic 8 ball, but
Yeah, so I guess the way I look at it, there seems to be two camps here. There's the To the Stars Academy, Mellon, Elizondos, who are, they put out these altruistic reasons for why they're doing it, right? Oh, for air aviation safety, or for disclosure, and the American public deserves the truth. All these very altruistic, which in my opinion is just BS. But at the same time, they're using deception tactics, or they're using bullying tactics to get what they want, or they're putting out false narratives, or they're injecting ambiguity. Then you look on the other camp. You have what started off as a naval organization of a UATP task force before it became Aero, who's trying to look at things along with NASA very scientifically, right? It's almost like you have these two camps, and now these two camps are opposing each other, and they're accusing each other of, either ignoring information, or belittling information, or not looking deep enough, or whatever. So you have this divide and conquer narrative going on right now, both which could be controlled by the same folks, right? So you keep those folks constantly at each other's throats, and the public doesn't know what to make of it. So they're caught in this two camp scenario. In the meantime, I think you're keeping the eye off of what may be truly hidden. Like maybe we deceived everybody in 1947 and we manipulated the media for that purpose, right? We're not the democracy we think we are. And folks went along with this, whatever that may be. Or it could be nothing to do. Maybe historically they don't have any shame and they don't care that gets out. Maybe there's a foreign influence issue here, or we're trying to get the Chinese to believe a certain thing, or the Russians to believe a certain thing. So whatever it is, it's a controlled narrative on both sides.
okay, thank you. And so, like with the Tic Tac, I mean, was that something that was put out there because it's, it could be us trying to show how superior we are with what we have?
Absolutely. And maybe we don't even have something that flies that fast or evades our aircraft that fast. Maybe we have the means to project it into your electronic warfare screen, so we could make it seem like we have a whole fleet of bombers coming your way that don't exist.
Right.
Yeah, when we talked earlier about a strategic deception will be designed to solicit an action or inaction. When you were describing that, I was thinking about some of the reported drone incursions, whatever those may or may not be, that oftentimes there's no response at all on behalf of the Navy ships that may see these flying objects, drones. And it's my understanding that while a lot of the UFO people say, why don't they just shoot them down? If they're so inferior, why don't they capture one, and these kind of things. And my understanding is because that may be giving them the response that they're trying to solicit, and to see what kind of signals intelligence you can pick up when the drone comes in. And so, yeah, sometimes the most intelligent idea of how to deal with it is just go radio silent and don't do anything. Yeah,
absolutely. The inaction in itself is a telling sign, right? It's kind of like if you look back at the 1946 Ghost rockets, when allegedly there were hundreds if not thousands of rockets flying over Stockholm. yet not one managed to crash, not one piece of metal was recovered. And the reaction in the US may have been alarming from military perspectives. But then you fast forward to the flying saucer summer of 1947, we have all of this intrusion of our airspace, yet the military doesn't increase their posture, even though they've been, in the press, they were constantly beating this drum about Russia potentially coming in and flying over the North Pole and bombing us into oblivion. Yet we allegedly have all these things flying in our airspace, but we do nothing about it. So that inaction tells you something as well.
Yeah, I'd highly recommend James's work on the ghost rockets as well, anachronisms. You can go to historydeceived.blogspot.com, and for free, you can download anachronisms in a PDF or the Roswell Deception, both. And you can read some of his blog posts. The ghost rocket work alone is another area that I could just launch into and work myself up to a sweat, explaining how this person tied into that person, and how the guy that gave the most recognized, the most comprehensive report on it comes back up later with NICAP affiliations and arguments with J. Edgar Hoover and Colonel Joseph Bryan III. And it's just a fascinating saga that we really don't have to, put all the push pins on the bulletin boards and tie all the strings together to hopefully effectively explain. It's really unlikely that that had anything to do with some type of non-human intelligence.
Yeah, exactly. Which makes you wonder why today, that other camp I was referring to that talks about the crash retrievals and the recovery of spacecraft and non-human remains, and going all the way back to Mussolini and Roswell, well, they're injecting a narrative that doesn't exist, right? If you look back at what happened truly in Roswell, you have lots of anecdotal information, but it doesn't match up to the raw evidence that's there. So that in itself tells you there's a controlled narrative going on.
Absolutely. And James, what is your opinion on NICAP? Because we've got, again, different camps, different beliefs on, was NICAP. I mean, obviously, Jack has demonstrated time and time again that NICAP, I mean, it was started by people in the intelligence community. But then you've got those who just think it was, people in the intelligence community, they were just interested in UFOs, and there wasn't anything nefarious until like the early 70s when Stuart Nixon kind of took the reins. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I find it interesting because of the quality of people that were involved. Look at Roscoe Hillenkotter, first director of the CIA. That's telling. Albert Wiedemeyer, who took over plans and operations, which was the operational arm of strategic deception. I mean, these guys have credentials that tell you that when they're pursuing these extracurricular activities, there may be more than meets the eye there. I mean, it just doesn't seem, I don't see them off chasing Nessie at Loch Ness or Sasquatch in the woods, right? Why is it specifically UFOs? I mean, it seems to be a controlled narrative there.
Yeah, it's not a car club or something, right? And then it has all of these intelligence officers and scientists, and it always breeds conspiracy ideas when men and women that are educated, have a work history, that they should know better, engage in behavior that essentially is trying to convince you that they don't know what they're doing doesn't make sense.
Right.
And I think James presents some really good ideas of why public misunderstanding is a byproduct and not the intention of the intelligence agency actions.
Right. And I think also if you look at it, if it's a controlled narrative, they're always going to build in plausible deniability, right? Roscoe Hillenkotter joined NICAP because he simply had an interest in UFOs. Prove me otherwise. Okay, if you try to prove it otherwise based on his credentials or his background, it's just conspiracy, because in fact it is conspiracy. If we don't have hard facts to the effect that he was part of NICAP for nefarious reasons, then we're just left with speculation and we're left with plausible deniability. And that plausible deniability is part and parcel of the intelligence community. And whenever they want to control a narrative.
Yes. Any final thoughts, Erica, James?
James, let me just ask you, if you were to give advice to somebody that was just coming into this topic for the first time, what would your advice be other than run?
Yeah, I wouldn't tell them run.
I know, I'm just kidding.
What I would tell them is make sure you have a high tolerance for ambiguity, number one, because that's part and parcel of the field. But two, ignore what you read in books, on the internet, even other people's, where you should ignore my work, for example, if you don't, because unless you're willing to go to the levels of reading the raw documentation that backs it up. Because if you're just going to read my book, I don't want you to take it at face value. I want you to click on every link and see that there is a raw document behind that. There's history there. It's raw data, whether it's a raw newspaper article or it's a raw document I got out of the National Archives or something that was previously classified. Read the raw data. Go for the raw data. Don't focus on the shiny new objects that come along. Because if all you're going to do is focus on the shiny, you might as well be in a ghost investigation, right? You might as well just go to haunted houses and get excited by those bumps in the night or whatever, because you can get the same endorphin release by investigating ghosts that you can, just
right,
chasing shiny UFOs, right?
And it's probably safer.
What's that?
And it's probably a safer subject to get into, because
exactly
the UFO subject, you've got all of these, intelligence games, or really, not that you don't paranormal, but I mean, it just seems much more benign.
You're absolutely right. Ghost hunters don't have to contend with intelligence agents running around your conference. They have no reason to, right? But they do for the UFO fields, and that tells you itself. There's a narrative there, there's a controlled narrative, and there's an ultimate truth. And what that ultimate truth is for 1946-47 may truly be just Cold War operations. Again, what came before, what came after, maybe there's a different ultimate truth, right? Maybe we did have alien visitation at some point that we're covering up. I don't know. I don't have enough data to substantiate that one way or another. But find something you're interested in this field. Stick to that narrow field, or a certain time of history, of UFO history, and do raw research. Go to the National Archives.
Thank you.
Yes, and again, I'll say find James's free books for download and his blog post at historydeceived.blogspot.com. Please consider supporting our work if you enjoy our YouTube channel and our blog posts and our archive. These are the types of things that folks at our Patreon are helping us finance. So please consider joining our supporters at Patreon, where they contribute for our records request fees and things like that bring you these blog posts and all of this information. You can also make a one-time donation if you would like by going to our website, expandingfrontiersresearch.org, and there's a donate button on the home page. And Erica, would you please give us final thoughts and take us out?
You know, I knew this would be a great interview, James. I always had take so much, gained so much from you to hear about your, not only your time in MUFON, some of the things that you dealt with, but also your research into espionage and some of the ways the intelligence community moves in this subject. And I think, to me, the more I realize, the more I've realized over the years that there's not a lot to ETs being here. And I found interest in people, people like you and your work, and that's why I think it's so important. And I definitely encourage everyone to do what Jack suggested, which is really do a deep dive into everything that you've done. And I wish you the best with everything, and hopefully you'll be on soon. I'm sure we'll have something more that we could talk about and dig up, and I really appreciate you. So thank you. And Jack, I appreciate you too. And I also want to thank all of our listeners for being here. We're moving from StreamYard, so we won't be broadcasting on StreamYard anymore, but we will have our shows either live or pre-recorded here on our YouTube channel. And again, make sure you like and subscribe and hit the bell for notifications. We really love doing what we're doing, and we're finding out some great things. And so definitely check out our blog spot. But all of you stay safe and have a happy Halloween, because, it is my favorite time of year. So, I'll do just that. So thanks, both of you.
Thank you, Eric. And I just want to say last words here. Yeah, it's been a real pleasure to be here with you and Jack. And I really appreciate talking with like-minded folks, especially critical thinkers, right? Folks who believe that critical thinking is one of the most important skills that is seriously lacking in today's society. So I really appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you very much. And that's great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Jack. Thanks, Erica.